Hello, and welcome to a special episode of Speaking of Nebraska. I'm Fred Knapp of NET News. Following the death of George Floyd at the hands of police in Minneapolis last spring, protests erupted across the nation, including in Lincoln, Omaha, and elsewhere in Nebraska. These demonstrations raised questions of how to ensure police accountability and sparked efforts to review police policies like the use of force. Some of those protests turned violent, with millions in property damage in Lincoln and Omaha, and raised questions about how to ensure public order. With me here are two people who will play key roles in how the Nebraska legislature answers questions like those in its 2021 session. Senator Justin Wayne of Omaha and Senator Tom Brewer of Gordon. Thank you both for being here.
Thanks for having us.
Senator Wayne, I want to start with you. You introduced legislation last year to require civilian boards to oversee police and complaints against them in Nebraska cities. Why do you think that's important?
Well, I think transparency, well, first, thanks for having me. And I think it's ironic that one of the two minority members in the legislature come from different backgrounds and have different political beliefs and are here to have a dialogue about racial relations. And you'll see, I think, from this dialogue is that the end goal is to make sure that government works for everybody, but how we get there is we often differ, and that's the conversation you'll see take place today. But specifically to your question, transparency is always good. And what's ironic is if you're on the right side of the aisle, you want government to be transparent. When you're on the left side of the aisle, you want government to be transparent. But when it comes to the interactions of police and community, somehow we have to not be transparent. And that's very interesting to me. And the reason we were looking at citizen oversight is because the public wants to know what happens. The problem is, or the difficulty is, police is still a job, and it still have rules and regs and things you have to follow to make sure you don't want your employer talking about your human resource issue when you're out there. And you say, well, it's different because it's police and it's public. It is, but it isn't. And so trying to balance privacy at the same time of community oversight is very, very difficult. But all in all, I think we have to have a transparent system in which police can be held accountable, and individual officers who may not do everything correctly are held accountable, but also those officers who are doing everything correctly are praised too. And I think the best way to do that is for citizens to be active in that process and oversee that process.
And Senator Brewer, I wanted to ask you about legislation you've discussed, which following the demonstrations and some of the violence and property damage, you announced a plan for strengthening penalties for protests that include property damage or violence or blocking roadways.
Correct.
Why do you favor those ideas?
Well, if you look at the entirety of the things that transpired, there were a number of things that happened. The worst of it, of course, was in Lincoln, but there was some in Omaha, too.
Where the building got burned out.
And the destruction of the buildings and that. I think that if we're going to live in a society that has rule of law, there has to be a way to have penalties so that those kind of behaviors are put into check. I would never want not to have the ability to protest. I had a chance to read a little about Senator Wayne's leading. Was it from 72nd to Memorial?
Correct.
An event where he did everything right. He got the permits, made sure that the police were blocking intersections. They were able to do what they wanted to do to get the message out, but they did it in a very proper way, and they were able to get their voice heard and be seen. That's the way it should be. You know, at the point where you turn into this world where buildings are burning and roads are blocked and really bad things are happening, we all of a sudden now transition from that First Amendment to chaos. And we need to make sure that those who come, and I think if you were to ask the police how many of the really violent bad people that came here and did some of those things were Nebraskans, I think that number would be fairly low. I think there were some who just came here with a purpose of really making the situation so much worse than it needed to be. And so for those, I think we need a way of making sure that they're not doing that at the drop of a hat for the wrong reasons.
Okay. I want to ask a little bit about where you guys are coming from as you formulate your approaches on these issues. Senator Wayne, you brought up these are two minority members of the legislature. You're biracial, black and white. Senator Brewer, you're Oglala Sioux and white. This is a white bread reporter question. How have your life experiences shaped how you approach these issues?
Well, I think it goes beyond the issues. I think one of the things that Senator Brewer and I have an interesting relationship is because regardless of what side of the aisle you're on, you walk into that body, there's only 2 or 3 of us. And there is a heavy burden that we cannot do the same things that other people can do. I recall one instance where Senator Brewer and another fellow senator started getting into it on the floor and voices started to be raised. And I just had to go remind Senator Brewer, hey, calm down, don't worry about it. You know, we'll get through it. But I don't think our other colleagues have to think about that because we'll be seen as a bully or stepping overboard or because we're a little taller in stature and because he has military experience and they'll think, well, he's trying to intimidate us. But when other people do it, it's called their linebacker voice or a linebacker voice, or they're just getting a little rowdy. And those subtle things that nobody really experienced creates a bond between me and Senator Brewer and I for us to work on these things. So my background and his background may be completely different growing up, but we'll all be put in situations where we have to be cognizant of things that other people don't. And I think that's how we've worked at least the last 4 years on legislation together, because there is things that we can talk about and understand that other people can't. And that's it. That's how I approach the legislation. And there's things we're going to disagree on just because of our beliefs. But we have to always control that conversation, I think, a little differently. Yeah. So when I introduce a bill, like the bill on police oversight, he may not agree with the bill in the entirety, but he may feel, well, let's at least have a hearing to have a conversation started, where I think some people who haven't been on the other end of any racial prejudicial experiences might say, well, I don't agree with the bill at all. Let's just not even have the conversation.
Senator Brewer, what's your thoughts on that?
Well, I would concur. I think if I was to pick someone in the legislature, either side of the aisle, doesn't matter, that I could go to and say, hey, this is what I'm thinking, and I need your honest opinion, it would be Senator Wayne, because for one, he doesn't pull any punches. He'll tell you what he thinks. But also, I think some people you just have kind of a natural bond because of maybe the fact that you've had similar experiences in life. And then some people, I think you have this, heart-to-heart friendship that is there regardless of the issue. And
you mentioned being on opposite sides of the aisle. They don't divide it that way because it's nonpartisan, but you're a Democrat, you're a Republican.
And there's probably more things we agree with than disagree with in many cases. It's just that when you have those issues that you come head-to-head with, some people in the body will kind of shove it in your face and be pretty brutal about how they deal with it, where I think Senator Wayne or I are in a situation where if we need to talk about it on the side and talk about a compromise, we can do that. Where others, there really isn't a compromise. It's your way or the highway. And, if we had more that were in that situation, we'd resolve more issues, quite frankly.
So let me, go ahead.
I was just going to say, so you think about it, you have 2 communities that we represent, and we represent more than just Black and Native American, but if you want to put us in those boxes, who were both brutalized by our government. And we have one who served their country honorably and is a Purple Heart and has received a Purple Heart, and he's saying, we might have to make sure we stop damages. And then somebody else on the other side who's been through, didn't serve his country in the same capacity, but has grown up where our government has brutalized African Americans, who are saying, well, if we're going to err, we need to err on the side of freedom of speech and the right to assemble. And that's a very complex issue, but if anybody in the body can come up with solutions to that, I believe we're probably the only two who can, because of those unique experiences.
So it is a complex issue, and I want to run a couple perspectives on the criminal justice system past you both. One is a recent study from the University of Nebraska, Omaha's Center for Public Affairs Research, that showed African Americans in Nebraska are being arrested at 4 times their percentage of the population, Native Americans at 3 times, and there are disparities in incarceration rates as well. Then there's this comment by Attorney General Doug Peterson before the study came out, but after years of similar controversies, when he was asked if there's systemic racism in the criminal justice system.
So I'm going to reject the phrase systemic racism because I believe it comes from a group who wants to create a certain narrative. What I'm going to say is let's have an honest discussion. Let's discuss where we've missed it from a law enforcement standpoint. Let's discuss it where we've missed it from a justice system standpoint.
So what are your perspectives? Are there systemic problems, or is it more a matter of something missing in law enforcement and criminal justice, or are there other factors at work here?
Well, I think there's multiple issues. I think there definitely is systemic racism, but there's also systemic classism, that a rich African-American male can afford different defense counsels than somebody who's poor and white. So I think that's a crossroads that has been convoluted probably since the 80s. I also think there are just different factors, and those factors can be diversity within the prosecution office. I think if you have a Native American or African American or somebody who grew up poor in the defense or in the Douglas County Attorney or Sarpy County Attorney's office, that's a different conversation. No different than if there's a woman at the table, that's a different conversation because they all bring their unique perspectives. So is there a systematic problem? Absolutely. And I think both of us have been on at least the LR 437 or 734 hearing committee where we went to the prisons and we looked at all the sentencing guidelines that are out there, and we tried to figure out the best way to deal with them. But it's so complex that you can only start off with a little bit here and there. And one of the bills that I passed was the juvenile gun bill that says you can't buy a gun after 18 to 25 if you've been convicted of a felony and or a judge says you've been fully rehabilitated. That was a stopgap measure that I felt was appropriate to deal with some of the things. But then we also had a loophole where you were incentivized to witness tamper. And so I passed the tough on crime bill, which would ultimately hurt, I think, some people in our community would say it would ultimately hurt because of the systematic racism, but it's such a big, complex problem. You do one thing and you find out, well, somebody's going to argue you hurt somebody over here. You do another thing.
Interconnected.
And it just keeps going back and forth.
What do you think, Senator Brewer? Systematic or subject to specific fixes?
Well, let's back up a little bit and understand on the Native American side of it, it's a little bit different world because you have an Indian reservation, and this is, of course, if it is a reservation. And on that reservation, you'll have 2 flavors of police officers. You'll have tribal police, which are your, let's call them the town cops. They require very little training. They're kind of the ones that are hired to take care of the most minor of issues. And then you have the Bureau of Indian Affairs Police, which are federal trained. They go to Flexi, to Georgia, to the training there. Of course, they're much more professional, but they're all Native. And because of that, it's kind of hard to throw that particular issue out because it becomes more personality based. But what happens is that once they leave the reservation, and to a degree it's the reservation system, they go into a world they don't understand. And they don't understand the consequences of their actions in some cases because they've lived in a petri dish of things that are very basic because, you know, the Indian reservations were designed many years ago, and to a degree they haven't changed much since then. And it's not something that educates you very well in the outside world. And what will happen is they become involved in crimes, and their tendency is to want to go back home. They don't understand that once you break the rules on either probation, parole, or coming back for sentencing, that there are some severe consequences with that. So they end up probably more offenses because of that. But, you know, to a degree, the issue of just having so few resources, because those that can afford an attorney and those that can't, there's two different worlds there, and how you're going to be treated and how you're going to end up in the eyes of law enforcement are directly going to correlate to whether or not you can afford that. So there's a poverty factor, I think, with it, and in the Native side of it, there's a lack of understanding of the outside world.
Sounds in some ways similar to what Senator Wayne was describing. I want to ask you also both about the balance between the right to protest and the need to maintain public order. I want to play a message that Nebraska State Patrol Superintendent John Bolduc had for protesters recently.
Please come and assemble peaceably, express your First Amendment rights, but at the point you begin to damage someone's property or attempt to injure a police officer or injure a person of a different opinion, those folks need to be arrested. That we have to draw a line. There is a clear difference between peaceful protest and anarchy or rioting behavior, and we simply cannot tolerate that.
So, Senator Brewer, with reference to your legislation, if a demonstration turns violent, given the disorder and chaos that would be likely present in that situation, how is it possible to distinguish between somebody who's there protesting peacefully versus somebody who's committing violence?
Well, that's not an easy one. You know, we dealt with many protests overseas when I was in the military, and that was something that we constantly had to deal with, because we didn't have some of the luxuries of body cams, things like that, to help distinguish that later. So in many cases, there were folks that were arrested and charged that probably didn't deserve it. You know, what we tried to stress to them, and again, this isn't a situation like Omaha, it's the ones we dealt with there, is that if you're there at the protest and it starts to become violent, one, be willing to identify those who are the ones that want it to be violent, and then also...
How easy is that to do, though?
Well, if someone shows up and they've got rocks or bottles or clubs or whatever, that person, you know, needs to be identified so that they can deal with them, and instead of just automatically accusing the whole crowd of being the ones doing it. The other part of it was, you know, you almost have to extricate yourself from that situation as best you can, because as that goes south, you know, once tear gas is deployed and it's hazy, smoky, whatever, you know, unfortunately then it really is a difficult situation to sort out what has happened and who's on, you know, the right side of things and who's are there that are doing the bad part of it. So I don't envy law enforcement trying to do that. That is a very difficult task. That's why, you know, if you're able to do that, and again, it's critical that you make sure you are identifying the right people, because if you're going to increase crimes to, say, a Class 3 felony, you don't want to put that on someone who didn't legitimately deserve it, because that's going to change their lives.
Senator Wayne, do you have concern that toughening those penalties for people who are involved in the violent parts of the demonstration would have a chilling effect on?
Absolutely, but I do want to raise the concern, because I led a protest or a march in Omaha that was successful, and we had no issues. I do want to stress that how important it is for blocking streets. I keep thinking about my grandmother. If something were to happen to her and we had to call 911, and if a street is blocked off and they can't get there, or it's delayed in the response over a protest that maybe she had nothing to do with, I think that's detrimental also to society. So I think we have to make sure we follow the rules and regs and make sure we keep the streets open. I do think increasing something to a felony, we have to make sure we get it right. And just rounding up people and saying you were all here together. I will tell you, I mean, I represented the Skurlock family, a young man who was killed during a protest. The one thing I was the proudest...
Not by police.
Not by police, but the one thing I was proudest of for that family was every protest they went to, they self-policed themselves. They left early. They made sure that they weren't going to be a part of anybody who wanted to come in and hijack a protest. And that's been the hardest thing, to Senator Brewer's point, the organizers have struggled with, is somebody from not Omaha who drives down from Minneapolis just to raise havoc, and they show up to a protest. How do you manage that? And so it's been difficult, but I think it can be done. But increasing it to a felony just doesn't sit well with me. It's just too many times, too many people are arrested who had nothing to do with the problem.
I also want to ask you something else about your approach of civilian police oversight. In a hearing this summer on that issue, opponents argued that there are already procedures in place to handle complaints against police. And Omaha Police Chief Todd Schmaderer complained about your bill. He said, the clearest way for a company or a police department to fail is if the CEO or chief did not have the ability to levy discipline or direct the culture of an agency. The Municipal Police Oversight Act, which is what your bill was called, undermines the authority of the chief of police. Were not even mentioned in the bill. Did he have a point?
Yeah, I think there's a point for a dialogue, but I also have to remind viewers that under this current administration, it's not an indictment on Chief Schmaderer. I think he's done a lot of good things. However, under this current administration, there was an individual who had a billy club, a sergeant, who was calling it an N-bopper to all new trainees. And he still got to retire with his full pension and had a small demotion before he retired. I mean, that is a problem. And so there needs to be some accountability to our public when they're here to serve our public.
Okay. Senator Brewer.
Yeah, and I had a chance to look at also the Lincoln oversight part of it, because when Detective Herrera's wife was added to that, I thought that was a good decision, because you're bringing a fair balance.
This is the widow of the police
officer
who was
serving
a warrant.
Killed this past summer, right. My concern is this, and of course, on the military side of it, we had oversight too, but where I had some issues there was, if say you're going to have oversight on the procedures a surgeon does, you'd want to find other surgeons to come in and say, yeah, he did it right, he did it wrong. And because of the complexity of the law enforcement mission, and I'm not an expert, but I'd been a reserve police officer years ago. I was a task force commander for the Counter-Narcotics Task Force here for Nebraska, trained the Afghan National Police Force, and my final job in Afghanistan was commanding the counter-narcotics forces for all of Afghanistan. So, you're managing 8,000 to 10,000 police officers. You get to see a lot of different issues. And if you're not fully versed on what's going on, it's pretty easy to, if you're completely outside of that realm of knowledge and you're put in there, it's easy to find fault. One of the things that was brought up in an incident that my brother, who's a sheriff, had to deal with was there was a stabbing that ended up in a shooting that killed an individual, and they were accused of cover-up because they didn't have body cams. Well, the body cam issue was because they were so poor they couldn't afford it, and it wasn't because they wanted to hide anything, but if you're an outsider looking in, it does look like that would be the easy answer. Just don't have a body cam, and then you can't be found to be, at fault for your actions.
Yeah.
So I think as we work through this, we need to be careful about how we shape that so that you don't hamstring those that are in the positions of authority within the agencies.
And I don't disagree with that. And so this year, Senator McKinney is going to champion the police oversight bill that I was working on last year. And I'm working more on the Nebraska Crime Commission and training aspect, because to Senator Brewer's point, as an attorney, if I get disciplined, I get disciplined by other attorneys who understand the profession. So we're going to try to Senator McKinney and I are going to take a two-prong approach and try to figure out where we can come in the middle on this issue.
And Senator Brewer.
May I follow up with a question?
Yeah.
The good senator. As a part of the Crime Commission part of that, will you take a look at, in the military we call it the program instruction, or the classes that are required for a police officer, and look at how they deal with mental health issues.
So I will send you over a draft of the bill. Maybe we can get a co-sponsor. See, you're building relationships here and building bridges.
Just do
we
our
are
part.
we are going to do a training piece where we start outlining, instead of just the 40-hour general requirements, we want core specific requirements for a couple hours of here and there to make sure we do look at those types of training and those type of extra things that I think all to give faith in the police force and our police departments that the community thinks that they need. And so we'll be looking at that, and I will send that over to you today, Senator Brewer.
And do you think that training will alleviate some of the problems and the conflict that we've been discussing?
Yeah, so I went through a training simulator this year, and I think I shot everything but the dog, is what they told me after we got done. But it's kind of funny, but kind of not. But what I found out in that process is Omaha and Sarpy County and Bellevue have these virtual simulators. They have one in Grand Island that they don't always use. So why don't we have one in Chadron? Why don't we have one in North Platte? Why don't we? Where officers and sheriffs across the state can come in and make sure they get real life situations where they can train on these things, because it's really real. You get a kickback on the gun. I mean, we need to provide those trainings across the state. So those are the things we're also looking at.
All right. Well, we just have a little bit of time left. I'd like to ask each of you, and it sounds like you agree more than you disagree. You know, I was hoping we'd have a knockdown drag out here. But in about a minute each, what are your thoughts on where do we go from here? You know, we had all this trouble this year. Is the rosy future in sight, or are we just sort of going to be at loggerheads now?
It depends on who you ask. For me, I think people across the state of Nebraska are looking to move forward. We're not forgetting the past and not forgetting what happened to George Floyd 500 miles away. But what we're talking about, at least for James Scurlock, the young man who lost his life, and what people I hang around and deal with are telling us, is we're talking about the implicit bias. We're talking about the structural problems of not having an attorney at the beginning versus having an attorney come in who has 50, 60 cases kind of in the middle. We're talking about the benefit of the doubt. We're talking about pretrial diversion. We're talking about all these things that we can do in the legislature to keep people out of prisons, but keep them also on the right path.
And Senator Brewer?
Well, I just finished a rather difficult discussion with friends of mine from the American Indian Movement, AIM. AIM is very similar in ways to Black Lives Matter, in that their original focus was trying to bring Native American issues forward. The problem is, along the way, they kind of got lost, and they ended up being more activist and probably more violent than they should have been, because there's a point where when folks no longer feel that you're providing a positive resource, they tend to shun you or not put a value on you. And I told them, I said, you know, you had opportunities to help with youth programs. You had opportunities to do the help that was needed, with everything from Meals on Wheels to actually educating some of the youth on what's right and what's wrong, instead of just being pure activists. I said, what we need to do is get back to where we're focused on the needs of the communities. And so, you know, that would be my concern, is with Black Lives Matter, we need to look at gang violence. We need to look at everything and figure out how to make sure that Black lives do matter, and we're doing everything, not just that slice of it. We get too focused on this, and we need to open our blinders a little bit.
All right. This interview and tonight's program are available on our website. Just go to netnebraska.org/speakingofnebraska and join the conversation on social media. Find us on Facebook and Twitter at NET News Nebraska. Speaking of Nebraska will return next month with an update on COVID-19 in the state from infectious disease experts. Tune in Thursday, January 14th at 7 p.m. Central on NET. Thanks for watching.